Hello and welcome to this new version of YAG, that's version 0.11.1. It brings a lot of small technical features that can be quite rich game-wise and also a more visual feature. There is no new content, by the way. Everything you see on screen is old stuff, but I'm going to need it to show the new features. So let's start with the new game tools. The first one is that we can now display some info over the pawns. So it's done here in the pawns panel with those two new options. So I'm going to select those pawns and enable the first option here. And when I do that, you can see that when the mouse is hovering over a pawn, then some info about that pawn are displayed. So at the moment we are displaying its name from its character sheet, if any, its unique identifier, which can be useful for to distinguish multiple pawns assigned to the same character sheet, and we're also displaying its health bar and its initiative. So this is the first option. The second option will simply display those info permanently. Okay, so I've got a few remarks here about that new tool. The first one is that, as you can see, it can become quite crowded when there is a lot of pawns. So don't forget that you can always uncheck the second option to come back to a hovering only option, so to speak. Right. The second remark is that if for some reason you need to disable those widgets, you can do that here. So for example, if a widget is blocking some view, or if you want to take a screenshot, you can just uncheck this box here and it will only affect your computer. Okay, this is a local effect, so if you need it for a screenshot or anything else, you can use that one. And the last remark is that this should be considered the first step, almost a draft of what the tool might become in the future. There's a lot to improve here, obviously, displaying things differently, adding more info like the state of the pawn, is it stunned, charmed, under a spell. Icons could be used also, probably also choosing what we want to display here and on the initiative tray would be interesting, and so on and so on. So the code I wrote should make all that possible with not too much trouble. My problem here is that I don't know what I want, so I'm releasing this tool in this quite early stage, and we'll see where it goes from the feedback I get. Okay, so I'm going to disable all those widgets. And next we've got three new options here in the setting panels. The first one is a bit violent. It will allow or forbid the player to move their pawn. So if I check this option, now the players won't be able to move around, won't be able to change the rotation of the camera. Basically they will be frozen in their current view. Okay, so combined with this button that exists, that has been there for quite a while, and that will force the player to see what I'm seeing as the dungeon master. Okay, those two options combined can help you force the player to be sure that they see exactly the same screen as you are seeing. Okay, which can be useful, for example, if you have prepared a scene and you want the player to see exactly the scene as you want them to see it, you know, a cinematic scene or anything, or if you want to prepare a surprise outside of the visible screen, you can just force the player here to see what you are seeing and to be unable to move. Okay, so that's a bit violent, but it's a possibility, it's just an option. The second option here will forbid the players to move any pawns on the scene. So if I activate it, you can see that I'm told that the pawn's displacement have been forbidden by the dungeon master. And if I'm not the dungeon master, which is now the case, and I try to move a pawn, I will be told by an error message that only the dungeon master is allowed to do that. Okay, this can be used in different ways. For example, we could, as the dungeon master, temporarily forbid the player to move their pawns. For example, if we don't want them to be distracted and if we want them to listen what we are currently saying, that's a possibility. Another possibility would be to let this option permanently enable. Okay, so that could be used as a security. When it's enabled, you know that the players will not move any pawns, will not misclick, will not move pawn by mistake, mistake, they will not touch anything they shouldn't touch, and so on. So that's a way to use it, and then we should, as the dungeon master again, just disable the option when the player can move their pawns during the round, and so on. Okay? So a different way to use that new option. And the last option here will freeze all the animations on screen. So here you can see that the dragon is now motionless. Okay, we can still move around and give orders and change things in the UI and so on. Only the animation are frozen. So that gives the illusion of a pause. This could be used in a game situation. The best way to show you that is to give you an example. So we're going to copy the scene here, and let's imagine for an instant that we are the dungeon master here playing the spider, and we've got two players playing the goblins. So this is quite a dramatic situation, of course, and you can say, okay, it's a panic, it's an emergency, we are all going to play simultaneously. So I'm putting on the pause here, I'm pausing the game here, and now move your pawns. So the player one could say, okay, I'm goblin, I'm afraid of a giant spider, I'm going to run away from it. The second player could think differently, could say, okay, I'm going to help my friend, so I'm going near him, and you as the dungeon master, of course, you will attack the nearest goblin. So when everybody has finished giving their orders, you can just resume the game, and the pawns will go where they have been told to, and instantly the second player will realize what a mistake he made trying to help his friend. Okay, so this is a way to use this option, and I think it can be very interesting in some game situations. So let me remove those pawns. I've got a few remarks about those tools here. The first one is that this pause here is a global pause, meaning that it will affect every computers and the server and the clients, and it can be used only by the dungeon master. But there is also a local pause here. It's the F4 key that will do exactly the same thing, but this is local only. So any player, dungeon master or any player, can use it. It will not affect the others. Okay, it can be useful if you want to take a nice screenshot, for example, and of course when you resume your game, all the pawns will be updated to the last state, the last common state. All right, so this is the first remark. The second remark is that this option here is quite violent. I mean, it's a bit harsh to forbid completely the player to move. So I only let this option in the panel setting because I believe it will be rarely used. But those two options here are much more common and frequently used, so I put a copy of them on the character sheet panel so that you can use them here while managing your round. Okay, and there is also a copy on the portable desk. All right, so there we go for those three new options. And finally, we have some new visual options here, there. Okay. So this panel here was previously where we could find the color filters, but I completely rewrote the code so that it's now easy, very easy for me to add some new effects. It's just a matter of almost some just drag and drop, almost. As a result, it is because it's so easy for me to add some effect. We have a lot of new one, and instead of 150 colors effect that we had previously, we now have about 1,200 of them. So we just enable this feature by checking this box here, and we can choose any new effect. Okay, so if you want your game to look like a very old movie, you can use the lithograph here. We've got a few thermal pseudo thermal camera. Okay, if you want to play Predator, that's a possibility here. And well, we've got 1,200 of them, so obviously I'm not going to show you all of them, but there is a lot of choice. Okay, so that's one thing, but I also added some new and richer post-processing effects. They can be shown checking this box, which will show alternatively the colors or the effect. You can distinguish them by the list, but that they can tend to be to look quite alike. I also added green box around the buttons here, and you can see that here we are displaying the colors and here we are displaying the effects. So we've got about 70 of them, and we can select one or more of them here in those checkbox, and they can be combined. Okay, this button here will completely clear the list of selected effects, and if we want to see the effect we have to enable the global mechanism here. So as a first example, we could use the alarm here to tell the players that an alarm or a trap has been triggered. Okay, and by the way, everyone will see exactly the same stuff here, the same effects. Okay, there is no, it's not possible for the moment to send one effect to one player and a different effect to a different player, so everybody will see the same thing here. Okay. We have obviously some more complex stuff like outlining, camera shaking, alcohol and drug abuse, raindrops, sci-fi stuff, and so on. Again, I'm not going to show you everything. One very important remark here, those effects are all post-processing effect, which means that they are applied to the final picture after it's been computed by the game, like a real-time Photoshop effect. So they will also affect the UI, and some of them will make it unusable. For example, if we play in a more modern or sci-fi setting, we could be tempted to use the nice neon green effect, which is a green outlining on black background, and it can be nice in some situation. Okay, but as you can see, it also affects the UI, and while the UI is still completely active, you can see the tooltip triggering sometimes, it's completely unusable because it's not readable. We can't read, so we don't know where to click, and in this situation we are stuck and we can't come back to a normal situation only using the UI. So because of that, I had to add a new key on the keyboard, and that's the N key, which will restore the default view. Okay, it will do so by just disabling those two checkboxes here. So click pressing the N key is exactly the same as disabling those two checkboxes here. Okay, it will not clear your selection, so you can come back to your list of effects just by re-enabling the effect here. Okay, it will simply disable that. So this button is obviously very important. It is documented in the virtual keyboard here. If you click on it, you'll get the info. And actually, and in fact, it is so important that I also made a special tooltip for it, reminding you that the N key brings back the default image. Okay. So again, keep this in mind. It's really important that you know it, because it is the only way to come back to a usable UI if you are stuck in a strange effect like here. Okay, for those of you who are interested in preparing screenshots or illustrations for the campaign, or maybe icons for some character, you'll see that things can become very graphic and dramatic pretty quickly. So I finished the video by showing you this in an instant, but first, while preparing this feature, I tested it with a friend, and she told me it would be useful to have a green screen to make it easier to work on the pictures in external graphic tools like Photoshop, GIMP, and so on. So I added a simple green, blue, and white screen material here in the default section. And if we apply it, you can see that we get a nice green screen. In the same vein, I did the same for the sky. So there is now a green sky that can be used as a green screen, and you can see that here we have a completely green screen. Okay, so I'm going to disable the blue sky. All right. Another thing to keep in mind with those green screen is that you can also use the light to get some different effects. So for example, here, if let's say we want to get rid of the shadow on the ground, we could just disable the sun and you can see that the shadow, the ground shadow, is now completely disappearing. And obviously we would have to increase the ambient diffuse light. Okay, so that's not very nice, but again, it allows you, if you take some screenshot of that, it allows you to post-work those images in some external tool, like if you want to detour them, or if you want to change the background, or to make the background transparent, and so on and so on. So do not forget to use the light to increase the options with those tools here. Alright, so to show you a couple of nice things, we'll let the green screen here, and we'll also trigger and pause the dragon fire attack. So let's do that. Something like that. So we can now look around with no problem. And the first thing I want to show is that we can get some very intense and powerful illustrations using, for example, the crosshatch black and white here. As you can see, it can make some very beautiful black and white contrasted screenshot here. We could even increase the effect by adding some more outlining. Okay, and in this mode you can see the rhino really looks like it was drawn by some talented artist. Very, very beautiful. Okay, or we could prefer to use some colors, and in that case we could, for example, use the second tune shader here, and you can see that again we get some pretty powerful illustration that can lead to very exotic and original screenshots. Okay, so lots of possibilities here. So I'm going to unpause the game, and just to show you, this can look nice also on some other characters if you want to get some very specific comics or ambience. And do not forget that you can again increase the possibilities using the lights. For example, here, if we want a little bit less shadow, we can increase a bit the indirect light, and you can see that we get a lighter sort of tone effect. Okay, the last thing I'd like to show you is the first tune shader here, because it can really lead to nice illustration as well. So let's check this one. As you can see, for example, for the spider here, it really makes some nice clear lines and very beautiful color illustration. So again, if you want to prepare a picture for a character, for a pawn or a monster, you can really use that that sort of option. Okay. Alright, I think this is it. I'm going to end this video here, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if it's the case, then as always, hopefully see you in the next. Thank you very much. Bye.